Log entry, May 16th. They told me this facility was built to clean the valley's runoff water. They lied. I'm standing at the viewing port of column 4 right now. My hand is pressed flat against the cold glass, and I can feel it. The limestone cylinder inside is cracked open. There is no rock under this mountain. There is a pulse, a wet, heavy, rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 like something old deciding that it's time to wake up. I have worked the night shift at the Harlan Ridge Water Treatment Facility for going on 19 years now. 19 years of the same walk down the same corridor, the same clipboard in my hand, the same sequence of gauges and ports and analog dials that I have read so many thousands of times that I no longer truly look at them. I simply know them. The way you know the sound of your own breathing in a quiet room, or the way you know the particular creak of the third step on your porch staircase. You stop registering it consciously, and it becomes part of the architecture of your days. The facility sits inside the eastern ridge of Harlan County, carved directly into the limestone and shale of the mountain itself. From the gravel access road, it looks like nothing at all. A low concrete facade, maybe 40 feet wide, with a single steel door painted the color of old moss, and a government placard bolted beside it that reads, Water Management Substation 7, District of Resource Allocation, and then a long sequence of agency codes that I have never once bothered to look up. Nobody drives out this way except the quarterly inspection team, and they never stay longer than it takes to sign the paper on my clipboard and get back into their white government-issued truck. I was hired through a contractor liaison in Lexington. The job listing described the position as an environmental systems monitor, which I later understood to mean that I sat alone in a subterranean facility for 8 hours a night, walked a route, and wrote numbers into a logbook. There was a 2-day orientation. They showed me the pressure systems, the flow management boards, the chemical neutralization tanks in sub-level 1. They gave me a laminated card with the emergency contact numbers. None of the numbers ever connected when I tested them during my first winter. I stopped testing them after that. The corridor that leads from the main entrance down to the primary operations floor is 112 steps long. I know this because I counted them once, during my third winter, when the fluorescent tube above the fire exit door had been flickering for 11 consecutive nights, and the rhythm of it began to feel, after a while, almost intentional. The walls in that corridor are unpainted poured concrete, perpetually damp to the touch. Not wet exactly, just cold and slightly yielding, the way the skin of a stone feels in a riverbed. There is a smell in the facility that I have never been able to adequately describe to anyone. It is sweet in a way that has no fruit or flower in it, faintly metallic, like the air before a thunderstorm, but warmer somehow, closer. I noticed it on my first shift and assumed it was some byproduct of the filtration chemistry. I stopped noticing it after a few months, the way you stop noticing the smell of your own home. The operations floor is 2 levels below the entrance. The ceiling is low, perhaps 9 feet, crossed with thick insulated pipes painted orange and black according to a coding system I was handed in a laminated diagram but never fully memorized. The hydraulic pump assemblies line the south wall, 4 of them, each the size of a compact car, running at all times. They produce a sound that is not so much a noise as a condition of the air in that room, a constant, low, resonant thrumming that you feel more in your sternum than you hear with your ears. By my 2nd year, I found it soothing. By my 5th year, I found that I slept poorly on my nights off, in the silence of my house in town, without that deep mechanical breath beneath me. My route is 23 points. I walk it twice per shift, once at the start of the night and once at the end, with a 3rd pass at the 4-hour mark if the primary pressure gauge in Section C drifts more than 4 psi from baseline. I carry a flashlight, even though every room has overhead lighting, because the overhead lighting fails without warning on an average of twice per month, and I learned early not to be caught in the dark in the deep sections of the facility. I carry a thermos of coffee that my wife makes before I leave the house. Black, no sugar. I carry the clipboard. I carry a ballpoint pen and a backup ballpoint pen, because once, in my 7th year, I ran out of ink halfway through a log entry and did not have a second pen. And the anxiety that produced in me was disproportionate in a way that I still do not entirely understand. The logbook entries are simple. Time, gauge reading, temperature reading from the census strips on the outer face of each observation column, any physical abnormalities. I initial each entry and move on. The logbooks are stored in a gray metal cabinet beside the operations desk, and they go back to 1977. I have read some of the early ones when the nights were slow. The handwriting of my predecessors has a certain quality to it, deliberate, unhurried, deeply, almost reverently calm. It was some time after the 2-hour mark on this particular night when I first noticed the discrepancy. I had completed my 2nd pass of the upper floor and come back to the operations desk to log my readings, and I was reaching into the cabinet for the current year's book when my hand instead found the edge of a much older one, a 1974 volume, thinner than the rest, its cover warped and brown at the corners with decades of ambient moisture. I do not know why I pulled it out. Perhaps the night had been unusually quiet. Perhaps I was simply tired and my attention wandered. I set it on the desk under the lamp and opened it to the first entry. The handwriting in the 1974 book was not like the others. It was the same deliberate quality, the same measured calm, but in the earliest pages, from before the facility was fully operational, there was something slightly different in the pressure beneath the pen strokes, as if the author had been writing very carefully, in the way a person writes carefully when they are trying very hard not to let their hand shake. The entries described a drilling operation. A geological survey team from the United States Geological Survey. A borehole project designated simply as Project Watershed, begun in the spring of 1974 at a depth target of approximately 2 miles beneath the ridge. I turned the pages slowly. On the 14th page, the entries changed. The handwriting became suddenly, uniformly, extremely calm. Not the careful calm of before. Something settled, something resolved. The entries after that date were shorter, more precise. They described a change in the core sample material retrieved from the borehole at approximately 10,400 feet of depth. The notation in the margin, written in a different hand, stated only, "Vault confirmed, fluid analyzed, distribution protocol initiated, pending federal authorization." I sat with that phrase for a long moment. Vault confirmed. I turned to the back of the cabinet and found another file I had never opened. A manila folder so old the clasp had corroded entirely. Inside were flow schematic diagrams, and I stood there under the lamp reading them for a long time, tracing the lines with my fingertip. The diagram showed the direction of water movement through the facility's primary systems, and what I had always understood to be the direction of flow, municipal supply water coming in from the county intake, being treated, being released into the ridge runoff channels downstream, was, according to these diagrams, precisely reversed. The flow moved outward from the deep core systems, not inward from the surface. The facility did not receive water from the county table. It released it into the county table. It had always released it for 50 years. Behind the schematics were photographs, Polaroids, their edges yellowed and slightly curled. They showed a group of men standing at the surface of the borehole site in what I recognized as the clearing on the east face of the ridge. The spot now overgrown but still visible if you know where to walk. The men were in coveralls and hard hats. They were holding equipment. They were looking at the camera. Not one of them was smiling, which is not itself unusual for a work photograph. But they were not smiling in the way of workers tired at the end of a shift. They were not smiling in the way of people who have arrived somewhere, who have found the thing they were looking for and whose faces have since grown very still, very open, very quiet. Their eyes held an expression that I could not name at first, and then I could name it, exactly. It was the particular peace of a person who no longer has any unresolved questions, who has stopped wanting. I thought about my wife. I thought about the way she hums quietly when she works in the garden in the evenings, a tuneless sound, low and content. I thought about my neighbor, Raymond, who has lived in the same house on Cutter's Creek Road for 63 years, and who once told me he would sooner stop breathing than leave this valley. I thought about the way people in this county speak of the mountain, not with reverence exactly, but with a kind of cellular loyalty, the way you are loyal to your own body. I thought about the water, about how everyone in town drinks the well water or the tap water, which draws from the same aquifer that runs beneath the ridge, about how it has always tasted faintly sweet in a way that has no fruit or flower in it. The tremor came at the 4-hour mark, just as I was walking back toward the operations desk. It was minor, a low rolling shudder in the floor, perhaps 3 seconds in duration, a kind of micro-seismic event that is not uncommon in karst limestone country. The overhead lights flickered once. A loose coupling on one of the upper pipes ticked sharply against its bracket. Then it was over, and the deep mechanical hum of the pumps resumed its steady breath. And I stood in the corridor, listening to the silence come back. Except that below the silence there was something else now. A sound that the facility had not produced before in 19 years of my listening to it. Faint and wet and rhythmic, coming from below, from sub-level 3, where primary observation column 4 was housed, the column that contained the original 1974 core sample. The limestone cylinder, retrieved from the base of the borehole, preserved in a sealed glass housing filled with a nitrogen purge atmosphere. The column I had been logging temperature readings for each of the past 19 years, without ever once being asked to open it, inspect it, or interact with it in any way beyond recording the number on the sensor strip outside the glass. Thump, thump, thump. I went down. Sub-level 3 is the lowest point of the facility, accessible only by a utility stairwell at the far end of the operations floor. The stairwell is narrow, the steps grated steel, the railing cold and slightly tacky with condensation. The temperature drops noticeably as you descend. By the time I reached the bottom landing, I could see my breath in the beam of my flashlight. Fine white wisps pulling sideways in the barely moving air. The chamber that houses column 4 is a room perhaps 30 feet square, with a low ceiling, and in the center of it stands the column itself, a glass housing approximately 8 feet tall and 2 feet in diameter, mounted on a heavy stainless steel base and connected at the top to the primary fluid management lines by a series of black rubber hoses. The column was leaking. Not a catastrophic breach. A slow, persistent weeping from a fracture that ran diagonally across the lower third of the housing, perhaps 18 inches long. The fluid inside was pooling on the concrete floor in a widening circle, dark-edged where it met the dust of the floor's surface. I stepped close and crouched down and pressed 2 fingers into the edge of the pool. The fluid was warm, not room temperature, warm in the way of a living interior, and thick, not viscous exactly, but weighted, purposeful in the way it moved across the floor, finding the low places with a slow, certain confidence. I stood and raised my flashlight and looked through the glass of the column. The fluid inside was cloudy with whatever had disturbed it, swirling slowly in long, translucent ribbons. The backlight panel behind the column, a fluorescent strip that runs the height of the housing, was still functioning, casting a pale, diffuse glow through the contaminated medium. And in that light, I could see the interior of the limestone core sample, where the tremor had split it cleanly and completely down its vertical axis, opening it the way you open a book. And what I was looking at inside the rock was not stratified geology. It was not any mineral formation I had been trained to recognize. What I was looking at, through the warm, cloudy, gently moving fluid that the earth had been producing in the dark for longer than this nation has existed, was a structure, massive and pale and mineralized over centuries into something indistinguishable from the surrounding limestone unless you knew, unless you stood here with your flashlight and your breath fogging the glass, and then it was unmistakable. Vertebrae, or something that had once been vertebrae, or that had always been meant to be vertebrae, calcified into the rock in a column that ran the full length of the split core sample, each segment articulated, each curve mathematically precise, and below the vertebral column, the suggestion of curving lateral structures, long, arching formations that spread outward from the central spine and bent back inward like the bars of a cage, or the ribs of something enormous that had been folded into the dark stone of this mountain before there was anyone alive to watch it go in. And it was moving, not dramatically, not visibly if you were not looking for it, but against the glass of the column, in the pooled warmth of the fluid, the upper section of the mineralized structure was pressing, slowly, steadily, a rhythmic, almost exploratory pressure. Thump, thump, thump. The way a thing presses that is not awake yet, but is becoming less asleep. I did not move for a very long time. I stood in the cold of sub-level 3 with my flashlight and my thermos and my clipboard, and I looked at what the mountain had always contained, what this facility had been built to manage and to distribute, and to quietly, over 50 years, introduce into the water table of every home and farm and school in this valley. The thing that made the water sweet, the thing that made the people calm and loyal and deeply, fiercely attached to the ridge in a way no one had ever thought to question. Because calm people do not question the source of their calm. My wife made the coffee in my thermos tonight. She drank the water from our tap. My children grew up drinking the water from our tap. My grandchildren, born in the valley, have never drunk any other water. Neither have I. For 19 years I have stood above this thing and written its temperature into a logbook, and driven home through the mountain dark, and sat at my own table and drunk a glass of water before bed the way you do, the way everyone does, the way we have all done in this valley for 2 full generations, without knowing what we were drinking from, or what, in the slow, patient dark a mile beneath our feet, had been feeding us all along. I did not call the emergency number. The numbers have never connected. I stood there in the warmth of the pooling fluid, and I listened to the mountain breathe. And after a while, without entirely deciding to, I reached out and pressed my palm flat against the outside of the glass column, over the fracture line, over the place where the warm fluid was weeping steadily out into the cold of the room, and I held it there. The pulse came up through the glass and into my hand like a second heartbeat, slow, patient, utterly certain of itself. I stayed until my shift ended. Then I walked up the stairs, and I wrote my log entry, and I drove home through the valley in the gray of early morning with the mountain at my back. And I did not tell my wife what I had found, because she was already awake and already humming that low, tuneless sound while she moved in the kitchen. And her face was so still and so open and so peacefully, completely resolved, that I did not have the heart, or perhaps the language, to disturb it. End of entry, May 16th.